Matt Powell claims to have thrown down the ultimate challenge to atheists. I doubt I will be the only one to take him up. So let's take a look at that challenge and see if atheism is completely doomed. Am I taking on a giant climbing wall? Or is this going to be as easy as falling off a log? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. I want to note that the video quality in Matt's video isn't as good as most of his videos. The fuzziness isn't a download issue. Matt's video is short, so we'll look at all of it.
So from generation to generation, as we accumulate genetic mutations, we actually accumulate 1 to 200 genetic mutations, or what's known as neutral mutations, per person per generation.
Unfortunately, Matt doesn't give us his sources for any of his research. When I looked for information on the rate of DNA mutations in humans, I found this. Every time human DNA is passed from one generation to the next, it accumulates 100 to 200 new mutations, according to a DNA sequencing analysis of the Y chromosome. This number, the first direct measurement of the human mutation rate, is equivalent to one mutation every 30 million base pairs and matches previous estimates from species comparisons and rare disease screens. This would confirm what Matt has said. So far, so good.
And so what that means is that our offspring will have 1 to 200 typographical errors that we did not have in our genetics.
Errors? How did you come up with the idea that these are errors? You just said a moment ago that they were
neutral mutations,
which would indicate that these are differences. But since they have no harmful effects, why do you call them errors? If you take this line of thought and apply it to the Bible, every word difference between different translations of the Bible and different copies of the Bible would be errors, in which case the Bible would be so full of errors as to be useless for determining which one to live by. Even Christian apologists agree that there are numerous copy errors in the Bible, so many that they don't even put a number on them. I've seen estimates of anywhere from a few thousand to 400,000. Yet despite the copy errors, like with the human genome, they say that they have no effect on any important doctrine of the faith.
And so population geneticists have all come to the conclusion that our genetics are actually deteriorating as we move on and as time progresses.
Are they? Population genetics has had a major influence on our understanding of how evolution works. For example, for the well-known gene's eye view of evolution developed by biologists such as G.C. Williams, W.D. Hamilton, and Richard Dawkins, stems directly from population genetic reasoning. Indeed, important aspects of gene's eye thinking were already present in Fisher's writings. Proponents of the gene's eye view argue that genes are the real beneficiaries of evolutionary process, genotypes and organisms that are mere temporary manifestations. Natural selection is at root a matter of competition between gene lineages for greater representation in the gene pool. Creating organisms with adaptive features is a strategy that genes have devised to secure their prosperity. Dawkins, 1976-1982. Gene's eye thinking has revolutionized many areas of evolutionary biology in the last 30 years. Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection very well explains the changes in time of heritable phenotypes. In the early 1900s, focusing on the evolution of genetic variants in the population, R.A. Fisher, S. Wright, and J.B.S. Haldane made fundamental theoretical contributions to population genetics. Fisher, in his 1922 paper, which was the first to introduce diffusion equations into population genetics, and Haldane in developing in 1927 the approximation of change of numbers of copies of very rare mutants by branching processes. Wright developed the theory on the effects of genetic drift, that is, random changes in small populations. While his theory was supported by only a minority of scientists in an era when the molecular basis of genes had yet to be proven and the effects of genetic drift were underestimated, Wright's theory made a great contribution to the connecting Mendelian genetics with the Darwinian theory of evolution. In higher organisms, genomic duplication is known to be extremely important for evolution. Therefore, genetic duplication is predicted to proceed in a nearly neutral manner based on mutation pressure and genetic drift. I have oversimplified this article by picking out the background and the conclusions that apply here. For a complete view of the data that supports these conclusions, click on the Springer Link article listed in the sources below. I also found this. DNA is a code made up of 4 chemicals: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. Every time a cell divides and copies its DNA, it accidentally introduces typos into the code, known as mutations. Most mutations are harmless, but some can cause damage. All cells have ways to proofread DNA, and the more resources that are devoted to proofreading, the less mutations occur. Simple organisms, such as bacteria, use less energy to reduce mutations because their genomes may tolerate more damage. More complex organisms, from yeast to humans, instead need to proofread their genomes more thoroughly. Recent research has shown that humans have a much lower mutation rate than chimpanzees and gorillas, their closest living relatives. Humans and other apes copy and proofread their DNA with basically the same biological machinery as yeast, which is about 1 billion years old. Yet humans and apes have only existed for a small fraction of this time, a few million years. Why then do humans need to replicate and proofread their DNA differently from apes? And could it be that the way mutations arise is still evolving? Previous research revealed that European people experience more mutations within certain DNA motifs, specifically the DNA sequences TCC, TCT, CCC, and ACC, than Africans or East Asians do. Now, Harris, who conducted the previous research, and Pritchard have compared how various human ethnic groups accumulate mutations and how these processes differ in different groups. Statistical analysis of the genomes of thousands of people from all over the world did indeed show that the mutation rates of many different 3-letter DNA motifs have changed during the past 20,000 years of human evolution. Harris and Pritchard report that when groups of humans left Africa and settled in isolated populations across different continents, each population quickly became better at avoiding mutations in some genome contexts, but worse in others. This suggests that the risk of passing on harmful mutations to future generations is changing and evolving at an even faster rate than was originally suspected. The results suggest that every human ethnic group carries specific variants of the genes which ensure that DNA replication and repair are accurate. These differences appear to influence which type of mutations are frequently passed down to future generations. An important next step will be to identify the genetic variants that could be controlling mutational patterns and how they affect human health. I could find no information that population geneticists agree that the human genome is deteriorating. I know of 2 population geneticists that hold to this view: creationist Dr. Rob Carter and Dr. John C. Sanford. Anyone want to lay any wagers that this is who Matt Powell considers to be the consensus of population geneticists? Most likely he hasn't read any of the material from the vast majority.
As we reproduce, our genetics become worse over time as a population. And so genetic entropy is something that evolutionists and atheists will often mock and say that it's a ridiculous idea that our genes could be deteriorating. But I'm sorry, if you have 1 to 200 typographical errors per person per generation, I mean, that over time is going to accumulate in the genetic pool and cause us to literally go extinct.
Now Matt takes his earlier mischaracterization of neutral genetic changes as errors and claims that these neutral changes are going to make the human race go extinct. How so? If I am making a pie and I change some of the ingredients in such a way that they have a neutral effect at the taste of the pie, such as substituting raw sugar for granulated sugar, how is that going to destroy the pie? I mean, other than it's still going to get eaten. Matt, if you want to claim that neutral changes in the genome are destroying humanity, you need to show how these changes are damaging. Merely claiming that it is so does make it impossible to directly refute your claim. Sort of like claiming no one can make a basket in your specific basket hoop and then hiding the hoop.
Population geneticists know that these errors that are accumulating will have some effect, even if that effect is vanishingly small.
I really wish that he would indicate his sources, as I could find nothing to support his claim here. I did find one article on genetic drift that cited this paper as one source for a similar claim, but when I read the paper, it says, because the vast majority of heritable mutations have very minor effects, and because we are all born with large numbers of them, they are, for the most part, recalcitrant to identification for their individual effects. This means that the myriad of clinical procedures for mitigating the consequences of bad genes, surgical procedures, pharmaceutical, nutritional supplements, and physical and psychiatric therapies, can only result in the relaxation of natural selection against a broad class of deleterious mutations. We will come back to the natural selection aspect. This was another source article for that paper, which concluded, we estimate that humans and chimpanzees have accumulated approximately 140,000 slightly deleterious mutations each, mutations that would have been eliminated by selection in myriads. These mutations have small effects since it can be inferred that they have selection coefficients less than 1 over NE for hominids, less than 10 to the negative 4. It should be noted that it is unlikely that the mutation accumulation is due to a recent relaxation of natural selection in humans due to an improvement in our living conditions, since the time of this improvement is short relative to overall length of human evolution. We would not expect the decline in fitness to continue indefinitely, since the absolute strength of selection on new mutations, both advantageous and deleterious, may increase as fitness declines. Furthermore, this accumulation of deleterious mutations may have been compensated in part by adaptive substitutions in gene expression and control regions and elsewhere in the genome. The relaxation of natural selection they are referring to is our adaptation through healthcare and control of our environment. Because humans have come to control the conditions that would have caused some people to die off more quickly, we have created a situation where those least adapted to survival are living longer and reproducing, thus reducing the effect of natural selection on the human genome. They compare that to the murids because the murids have not similarly changed their environments. But the studies find that though we have reduced natural selection, the same therapies that allow for increased harmful errors in the human genome also cause the errors to have a net neutral effect on human health and reproducibility overall.
So all mutations, all errors in the human genome must have some effect on fitness.
Not really. Again, he keeps calling all mutations errors when they are not errors, just differences. As the Knightley paper pointed out, even the deleterious mutations are compensated for elsewhere.
In 2003, the Human Genome Project was completed, and they found as well that we lose 1 to 2% of our genetic information as human beings per generation. So our offspring is losing genetic information as time moves on. Mutations are accumulating in the genetic code, and this is causing us to go extinct as a population.
Extinct? Or causing us to evolve? Matt, you frequently argue that evolution does not happen, yet here you are making the argument that human genes are slowly changing over time, so much so that we will no longer be the same species. that we are going extinct because our genome is changing as gene changes become permanent in the human genome. Congratulations. You finally got it. That is evolution. Change in allele frequency over time, causing speciation. You got it. You heard it here, folks. Matt Powell has endorsed evolution.
There are scientific papers that have been written about why we should have been extinct 100 times over, if evolution were even true. And so, the way that evolutionists try to rescue this is by invoking natural selection. But the problem is that natural selection cannot detect neutral mutations. So these 100 to 200 typographical errors in our bodies that get passed on from generation to generation cannot be detected by natural selection and therefore cannot be weeded out.
And now he backtracks. This can't be evolution because natural selection can't remove the neutral gene changes. The neutral gene changes don't have any effect on us. Why would natural selection need to weed them out? And suddenly, the errors are no longer errors, they're just differences.
Natural selection only selects and removes the genes that are most deleterious, or the mutations that are the most deleterious. It might enhance your best beneficial mutation and might remove the worst deleterious mutation, but the neutral mutations are completely invisible to natural selection. Selection cannot act upon them.
So Matt now understands natural selection. Natural selection weeds out deleterious mutations in favor of advantageous mutations, leaving the neutral mutations. What's the issue? Why does he think neutral changes need to be weeded out?
And so natural selection has its limits. And so for evolutionists to claim that natural selection is what's causing us to select beneficial mutations, and those beneficial mutations make us better over time.
Here's part of the problem. No one is saying the mutations make us better over time. Natural selection doesn't have a goal of making an organism better. No one is saying that organisms are getting better over time. Rather, natural selection selects for what is best suited to the current environment. To borrow from Paulogia on the subject,
and here's the thing about mutations, and any kind of categorization of uphill or downhill, good or bad. A benefit in one environment might be a detriment in another. A mutation that makes a bear's fur white is very helpful in the Arctic and very detrimental in the forest. And because environments change, attributes that were once negative or neutral can suddenly become positive when climate or natural resources change, or vice versa. Perhaps the food supply becomes higher in a tree or lower to the ground. The advantage flips. There's no such thing as an objectively good mutation or an objectively bad mutation. And even benefits come with costs in terms of energy expenditure or other compromises. So any graph one may try to make plotting the usefulness of mutations would be valid for one and only one environment. Change the environment, and you change the graph.
Well, even if that were the case, we're still getting 1 to 200 neutral mutations or typographical errors in our genetics that are building up along with those beneficial mutations, even if you were to grant their argument. And so errors over time will cause death.
Neutral changes in the genome, neutral changes that have no visible effects on an organism over time, will cause death. Where is he getting this from? Again, no sources, no data. Matt, if you want to challenge people to refute your point, you need to finish making the point, which means supporting it, not just making a claim. Since you have no data, I have to guess at the basis of your claim. Likely, he is thinking of the straw that broke the camel's back. One straw has no effect when you ask a camel to carry it, or 2, or 5, or 50. But if you keep putting straw on the camel's back, eventually you will have too much weight for the camel to carry. A more accurate analogy would be repainting a white room. You can put coat after coat of white paint on, and you won't change the room. Each coat is a new coat. Each makes a change with no visible effect. But no matter how many coats of paint you put on, it's still a white room. If you change the paint color, now you affect the room. Matt's second problem is he sees all the genetic changes adding up to the point where you have nothing left of the original genome. Goodness, is this possible? Theoretically, yes, but in practicality, it depends. According to the American Phytopathological Society, the chance of fixing an allele due to genetic drift depends on the effective population size as well as the frequency distribution of alleles at the locus. To fix an allele means that the allele is present at a frequency of 1.0, so all individuals in the population have the same allele at a locus. Large effective population sizes and an even distribution of allele frequencies tend to decrease the probability that an allele will become fixed. In other words, genetic changes generally don't reproduce. When they do, they don't necessarily reproduce in the same location in the next generation. But when they do, with enough changes, you get speciation. So is Matt right? Have there been so many changes in the human genome that if humans were on the planet for 300,000 years, we would have evolved into a new species a few times now? No, because most changes are neutral. They have no net effect on our species. But could the cumulative effect of neutral changes result in changes that do affect us? Yes, they could. But once that happens, then natural selection does kick in.
What Sanford says is that as mutations accumulate, the population is going to get worse uniformly. So mutations increase, and you approach this threshold of viability over generations. And once you hit that threshold, you keep having mutations accumulating because you can't select them out, even when there's a fitness cost. In real life, mutations are going to occur. That's going to cause variation within a population because everyone's going to get different random mutations. And the individuals that cross that threshold into inviability, those mutations or those genotypes are going to get selected out. The rest of the population is going to be fine. So the result is an equilibrium right around this tipping point that's called mutation selection balance.
If a person's genome has sufficiently changed for a net negative effect, such as greater susceptibility to cancer, natural selection kicks in, causing the person to die or have fewer offspring to pass those genes on to, thus maintaining a net neutral effect on the species. Further, there are some species of animals with short lifespans and breeding generations, such as fruit flies. If the genome of a species drifted to entropy, we would have observed this, if nowhere else, in these species. If this was an event that should lead to extinction, fruit flies should have gone extinct thousands of years ago. Matt doesn't say that humans are unique in this claimed genetic entropy. If he thinks this is a uniquely human trait, he not only needs to say so, he needs to demonstrate why this is so. Since human DNA undergoes mutations at a similar, albeit slower rate than other animals, Matt needs to tell us why we should expect to see this phenomena in humans and not in other animals.
So for evolutionists to claim that natural selection is going to preserve us as a population, when natural selection cannot even detect these deleterious mutations that are getting added to the genetic pool, it just goes to show that this crowd, these YouTube atheists, are the most scientifically illiterate people that exist.
Why is Matt conflating evolution with YouTube atheists? First, most people that believe in evolution are Christians. It's a theory of science, not religion. It is true that most who deny evolution are believers, but that's only because their religion tells them that they must deny reality to please God. I'm not saying all Christian faiths do that. They don't. Only the ones that require you to deny evolution or any other reality to hold to biblical inerrancy. Second, what on earth does genetic drift have to do with YouTube? How are YouTube atheists more scientifically illiterate than, say, atheists that say the same thing but are not on YouTube? Or Christians that say the same thing, whether on YouTube or not? Do you think that the idea is scientifically illiterate? Or is it only scientifically illiterate to say it on YouTube? Finally, talk about scientifically illiterate. This accusation is rich, coming from the man that said pterodactyls were shot during the Civil War, and his proof is a fictional movie.
I believe if we study history,
The Confederates were able to shoot pterodactyls, back in the Civil War, and they spread these things out. Anybody can look it up online. They spread these things out, and this is a historical fact.
And that humans evolved from African Americans.
Evolution should just flat out be canceled just based on the fact that it's totally based in racism. If it's about survival of the fittest and we evolved from African Americans into other Americans, what about the African Americans that are still alive today?
How can a species that starts in America be African? Or if they started in Africa, how can they be Americans? Matt understands nothing about evolution, despite being told how wrong he is countless times. Then he has the audacity to call atheist YouTubers scientifically illiterate. I will own that I am no scientist. Much of what I know of science I learned from YouTube, or from reading articles while making a video, or from reading the odd book here and there. But Matt, if you think dinosaurs lived in the United States during the Civil War, other than the modern dinosaurs, that is, and that humans descended from African American ancestors, maybe you should try listening to some of those scientist YouTubers instead of just looking at the thumbnails. Personally, I recommend Jackson Wheat, Erica Gutzik-Gibbon, Professor Stick, Stated Clearly, Scientist Mel, Almost a Doctor, and Aaron Ra. And though they are not scientists, also viced Rhino and Paulogia.
And just the fact that they could believe in Big Bang cosmology, or that pond scum turned to human over time, or fish turned to fishermen over time, or bacteria to biologists. This proves that these people cannot be trusted.
So what does that say about the guy who claimed that evolution is an inherently racist idea? You know what? I'm not even going to fill in that blank. I'm going to let you, the viewer, do it for me. What do you think that this says about Matt Powell's integrity? I'll feature some of the best comments in my next video.
Because people that actually use free thought and that can do scientific empirical methods will not come to such ridiculous conclusions that the world popped into existence from nothing with no cause associated with it.
Scientifically literate people know that abiogenesis, how the universe came into being, has nothing to do with evolution. Entirely different fields of science.
I mean, folks, this stuff is absolutely pathetic on absolutely every level. And as creationists, we should constantly be calling them out. And one of the favorite talking points that I've found that are out there on our side is that we gain these genetic mutations and that they cannot be weeded out by natural selection. That is proof positive that we started out perfect as a genetic species and then we became worse over time.
How have humans become worse over time? Humans live longer now than at any other point in recorded history, other than the backward step we took in 2020 due to the pandemic. If you're looking at the Bible, that wasn't a time of recorded history. It was written much later. But other than the pandemic, where do you see human bodies deteriorating or having reduced life expectancy? A few facts and figures, even some cherry-picked data or quote mining, would be better than these bare-assed claims. Newsflash, Matt. You are a pastor, not a scientist. You have seriously embarrassed yourself and creationists multiple times in the past months, yet here you are throwing down an invisible gauntlet and claiming that no one can pick it up. But once again, you are wrong. I have picked it up. There's a good reason why you cite nothing to support your claims. Very few scientists agree with you, and there is no credible data to back you up.
Not a single cell becoming better over time, but the human population being created perfectly in the beginning and then becoming worse over time. And so even if we granted evolution to be true, if there was a single-celled organism at the beginning, which all life descended from, that single-celled organism would have just reproduced worse copies of itself, and it would have died out as it accumulated mutations. And so natural selection only selects information that exists. It doesn't create new information, it simply selects, hence the name natural selection.
He's 40 seconds from the end, and he finally presents something with some semblance of a coherent idea. Most likely he took this from John C. Stanford's book, Genetic Entropy, in which Stanford claims there are no beneficial mutations. But we know this to be false. Scientists have observed this in laboratories. One example is when E. coli bacteria were stored with citrate, a substance it cannot digest without oxygen. Yet, in the experiment, a new species of bacteria evolved that could digest the citrate. The bacteria were being stored in citrate because the inability to digest citrate is a defining characteristic of E. coli bacteria. The fact that it evolved in just a few generations to be able to digest the citrate it was stored in is proof that beneficial mutations can and do evolve.
Even if you had a single-celled organism at the beginning, like I said, it would have copied worse versions of itself. Think about it. Nobody would ever go to a copying machine and say that the copy is better than the original. But according to evolution, the copy, yeah, that's way better than the original.
Matt, human offspring are not copies. I never thought I would have to explain sexual reproduction to a man. Am I woman-splaining? Matt, it goes like this. When a mommy and a daddy love each other very much, they make a baby. The baby is not a copy of the mommy or the daddy. The baby gets half its genetic material from the mommy and half from the daddy. The baby is never a copy of either, not unless the baby is a clone. In the case of single-celled organisms, yes, these are exact copies, unless they have genetic mutations. But the mutations are not necessarily worse versions of itself. Most mutations are neutral, not worse. Some are better, like the citrus-eating E. coli. And those that are worse will die out by natural selection, leaving those that are the same and those that are better. Does this make sense, Matt? Probably not. He probably left to go pterodactyl hunting. I feel like I've climbed to the top of Matt's great challenge, only to find that it was a 3-foot wall, and I could pat the top of it without ever having lifted a foot. Oh well. I learned a lot about population genetics while making this video. I hope you did too from listening. Live your life.